While generals made speeches, they just worked. They rose before dawn, long before the headlines, before the parades, before the medals. When war emptied the cities and the nation ran short on everything but fear, they still fed it. Through dust storms, droughts, and winters that cracked the earth in two, the ranchers of America kept the country alive. No flags, no fanfare. Just calloused hands, steady hearts, and faith that hard work could still save a nation. They didn't fight with rifles, they fought with plows, with cattle, with grit. And somehow, while the world burned, they turned hunger into hope. Today we'll remember the forgotten ranchers who saved a nation from starvation. The morning light came slow over the plains, frost clung to the wire fence, and the cattle's breath rose in gray clouds. In the distance, a man in a wool cap rode the fence line, his horse's hooves muffled in the frozen dirt. He didn't know it, but every step that horse took was part of a war effort half a world away. He was one of the millions of American ranchers who never wore a uniform, yet fed every soldier who did. When the world caught fire in 1939, Washington called it a global crisis. But out here, in the silence between the wind and the lowing of cattle, the crisis had another face: shortage. Feed, fuel, hands, everything was suddenly scarce. The sons went to war, the railroads filled with troop trains, and the land was left to the old men, the women and the children who stayed behind. They became the quiet front line. In towns like Dodge City, Amarillo, and Sheridan, notices from the War Food Administration went up in post offices and grain depots. Produce more, feed the fight. The posters showed smiling cowboys and full barns, but the truth was grimmer. The soil still bore the scars of the Dust Bowl, and rain came in grudging drizzles. A single summer storm could make or break a family. Still, the ranchers answered. They fixed their tractors with baling wire, split every gallon of fuel, and stretched every acre of pasture they had left. They didn't talk about patriotism. They just called it the work. A rancher in Kansas said it best when a reporter asked why he stayed behind while his boys shipped off to France. "Somebody's got to feed him," he said, tightening the cinch on his saddle. That was all. No glory, no speech, just duty. Every morning began the same. Coffee before dawn, then the long walk to the pens. The radio crackled with news of battles in places they couldn't pronounce. Normandy, Tarawa, Bastogne. But while armies fought with steel and blood, these people fought with calloused hands, coaxing life from worn-out ground. The cows didn't care who was winning. They still needed hay, water, and a steady hand to drive them through winter. Government inspectors came sometimes, clipboards in hand, reminding the ranchers of production quotas. "You'll need to increase your beef yield by 20%, they'd say, as if the land could be ordered like a machine. But the ranchers knew better. They had seen too many good years turn bad. They made do, breeding stock they couldn't afford to lose, patching barns with old tin, turning broken tools into something that might last one more season. In 1942, the price of beef rose. The war demanded fat, tallow for explosives, leather for boots, meat for soldiers. A steer that once sold for $30 now fetched nearly double. But few ranchers celebrated. The profit was swallowed by inflation, by rationing, by scarcity of everything from salt blocks to spare parts. "You can't eat money," one old hand said, "but a man's got to eat." There were no medals for keeping the nation fed. No parades for the women who milked cows under lantern light, or the old men who drove trucks so heavy their axles snapped. Yet without them, the supply lines to Europe would have run dry. The U.S. Army Quartermaster Corps depended on their shipments, measured in pounds of beef, lard, and canned milk. By 1944, over two-thirds of all food consumed by Allied forces originated from small and mid-size American ranches. The work of anonymity sustained an army of millions. The hardships built quietly into their bones. Droughts came again, and with them dust storms that turned daylight into brass. The cows coughed through grit and wind, and families prayed over dry wells. Yet, they endured. They always did. Because the land was more than soil. It was memory. It was what their fathers had carved from wilderness, what their sons would fight to return to. By the winter of 1945, the radio spoke of victory. Berlin was falling, and Tokyo's empire was crumbling. In cities, people cheered in the streets. On the ranches, the men just nodded, tipped their hats, and went back to work. There were still fences to mend, calves to brand, hay to haul. The war was ending, but hunger never did. When the soldiers came home, they'd find the barns standing, the stock fed, the fields still turning under the plow. Because while the world fought for freedom, someone had to keep it alive. The generals wrote the speeches, the politicians took the credit. But history, if you listen close enough, still carries the faint sound of hooves on cold earth, the sound of men and women who fought their war without ever leaving home. And in that silence, something larger was born. The truth that a nation can be saved not only by courage on the battlefield, but by endurance in the field itself. They called it duty. The rest of us years later would call it sacrifice. Next came the years before the war, the long, dry struggle that hardened these families long before any ration card or victory poster. Before the war, there was only dust. The 1930s had stripped the land bare, and the people with it. The sky itself seemed to have turned against them, brown, rolling clouds that swallowed the horizon and blotted out the sun. When the wind came, it came like judgment. It hissed through cracks in the siding, filled the cupboards, coated the plates, settled in the lungs of children. They called it the Dust Bowl, but for the ranchers it was something worse, a test of whether they could outlast the land they loved. Men stood at fence lines, watching the earth drift away in waves, the topsoil blowing east toward Chicago and beyond. Crops failed, cattle starved, and banks came to collect notes that could no longer be paid. By 1935, a quarter of all ranches in Kansas and Oklahoma had folded. Yet the ones who stayed not from stubbornness but from faith, a belief that the land could forgive them if they learned how to listen. They built windbreaks of cedar and plum, dug contour furrows to catch the rain, prayed for clouds that didn't come. The Depression had already emptied their pockets, but it hadn't emptied their pride. They fixed their harnesses with wire and glue, stretched shoes until the soles cracked. Every decision came down to one question: can we make it through another season? The answer was always the same: try. A man's measure wasn't how much he owned, but whether he quit, and quitting was something they didn't know how to do. In those years, the ranch became both sanctuary and prison. Mothers cooked beans 3 times a week, counted the eggs, traded butter for flour in town. Children learned early to mend fences, to ride, to pray for rain instead of toys. There was no glamour in ranching, only the daily repetition of necessity. But it was this crucible that forged the people who would feed the nation when war came. They didn't know it yet, but endurance was becoming their inheritance. Out on the plains of western Texas, one rancher named Thomas Hart watched his herd thin by the week. His water holes had dried to mud. He lost half his cattle in 1934 and nearly lost the rest the following spring. Yet every dawn he saddled up, rode to the back pasture and checked the few he had left. "The Lord'll send rain when he's ready," he told his wife, though his voice carried no conviction. But the rains did come, just enough to green the grass again. That single summer saved him. 10 years later, his beef would be feeding soldiers in France. Government programs came and went. The Soil Conservation Service sent field agents with clipboards and pamphlets full of new methods: rotate pastures, plant cover crops, build terraces. Most ranchers met them with suspicion. They'd been lectured before by men who never dug a post hole. But slowly those lessons took hold. They learned to heal the land they'd wounded. By 1938, the skies had softened, and in the careful furrows of new grass lay a hard-earned wisdom how to make the land last. When the markets returned, so did hope. A steer might only bring $20, but it meant food, fuel in another year. Families who had weathered the drought stood taller. The young ones who'd grown up through it, thin, quiet, sunburned, were the same men who would soon wear uniforms. They had already fought their first war, not with rifles, but with plows and grit. The old-timers still remembered the days before tractors, when a team of horses did the work of machines. They laughed at the thought that the government now called them essential producers. For them, nothing had changed. You got up, you worked, and you prayed that the land would hold. Their barns were patched, their wells shallow, their hands split with years of labor, but they knew every inch of their country in ways no map could show. The war was still a distant thunder when 1939 rolled across the plains. Europe burned, and America looked inward. Yet in those dry, wind-bitten hills, the people who had survived the Dust Bowl were ready for whatever came next. They had learned that survival wasn't about strength. It was about staying when others left. By the time the first draft notices arrived, their sons were already conditioned to hardship. They'd known hunger, thirst, and loss. They could fix anything with a piece of wire and a hammer. When the recruiters asked if they could ride, shoot, and work without complaint, they only smiled. "We've been doing that all our lives," they said. The nation would soon lean on them again, not just to fight, but to feed. And when the boys went off to war, the land they left behind would become their mother's battlefield. The telegrams came in spring, thin yellow envelopes that carried the sound of train whistles and goodbyes. Across the plains, mothers wiped their hands on aprons as uniformed sons kissed them once on the cheek and climbed onto buses bound for distant coasts. The towns grew quiet, the schoolyards emptier, the dance halls hollow with echoes. And back on the ranches, the work did not wait. Someone had to feed the army. Those boys had joined. In 1942, the war reached deep into the heartland, not with bombs, but with absence. The hands that once threw hay, fixed gates, or drove cattle down from the hills were now in Europe or the Pacific. Fathers stayed behind with rheumatic knees and backs worn by decades of work. Wives took to the fields, learning to hitch plows and handle livestock. Teenage daughters climbed into the driver's seats of flatbed trucks, hauling feed sacks taller than themselves. The war didn't ask who was ready, it simply required that no one stop. There was no time for grief. Calves needed branding, wells needed pumping, and the quota from the War Food Administration hung like a silent command: produce more. The government paid bonuses for beef, pork, and dairy, but money meant little when there wasn't enough labor to load the wagons. Ranchers bartered for help, trading milk for fuel, meat for spare parts. In some counties, prisoners of war, Italians and Germans captured overseas, were brought to work the fields. They stood beside Americans under the same sun, silent, sweating, doing the same honest labor. Out here, even enemies became farmhands. Letters from overseas arrived folded, smudged with sweat and dust. "Tell Dad I still remember how to mend fence," one young corporal wrote from France. Another said, "The smell of wet hay here reminds me of home." Those words kept their families going when the nights grew long and the wind screamed through the cracks of old barns. They worked by lantern light, holding on to the thought that feeding the nation meant feeding their own boys too. On the prairie north of Amarillo, one widow named Clara Jensen ran 200 head of cattle alone after her husband and son enlisted. She rose before dawn, tied her braid tight, and rode out every morning with a Winchester across her saddle. Coyotes tested her fences. She shot 2 one winter and hung their hides on the barn wall as trophies. When the neighbors offered help, she only said, "I'll manage." And she did. In 3 years, she never missed a delivery. Her beef fed troops at Omaha Beach. It wasn't heroism they sought, it was survival. Every bale of hay stacked, every barrel of lard rendered, every load of beef hauled eastward was another quiet victory. The war effort depended on steel and oil, yes, but also on the humble steadiness of those who kept food moving through the arteries of a vast nation. For every bomber in the sky, there were 100 ranchers on the ground keeping the engines of war from starving. The shortages changed everything. Tires were rationed, gasoline came by coupon. One man in Nebraska cut the tires from an old thresher to patch the roof of his barn. Another melted down broken horseshoes to mend a wagon axle. Nothing was wasted. Even the scraps of fat from slaughtered hogs went into the production of glycerin for explosives. The same hands that fed soldiers also supplied the firepower that defended them. Sundays, once a day of rest, turned into work days. The churches were half full, the pews lined with women in overalls and men too old to fight but too proud to stop working. They prayed not for victory but for rain, for endurance, for letters that said, "I'm coming home." And when the news of D-Day broke across the radio, they paused only long enough to bow their heads, then went back to the chores. There were calves to brand and fences to fix, victory or not. The land became their companion and their witness. Every furrow they plowed, every hoofprint pressed into the soil, spoke of a quiet loyalty that no one in Washington could measure. The ranchers didn't see themselves as patriots, they simply did what the land demanded. But the truth is, they kept the country alive when its young blood was far away. By the time 1945 neared, the herds were thinner but the spirit thicker. The boys would come home to find their mothers' hands calloused, their fathers' shoulders bent but unbroken. They'd find barns standing, corrals mended, and the smell of supper still rising from kitchen stoves. They had left behind farms that were supposed to fade, but instead they had bloomed under the hardest years the country had ever known. The women would soon carry more than memory. They would carry the backbone of a nation rebuilt in silence. At dawn, before the roosters called, she was already awake. The kitchen smelled of coffee and wood smoke, the stove glowing faintly against the chill. Her name could have been Clara, or Ruth, or Lillian, one of the thousands who rose in the dark across Texas, Kansas, Wyoming, and the Dakotas to shoulder the weight of an entire ranch. When the men left for war, these women didn't just keep the home, they became it. Out in the yard, Frost clung to the pump handle. She wrapped her fingers around it, drew water that steamed in the cold, and poured it for the cattle before the troughs froze solid. The horse waited saddled, its breath clouding the air. Her skirt was gone, replaced by canvas overalls and a belt that carried a knife and a length of twine. The prairie didn't care what she wore. It cared only that she showed up. Across the Great Plains, women ranched alone or in small bands of neighbors who helped one another survive. They mended fences, delivered calves, and hauled feed sacks that weighed nearly as much as they did. When a windmill broke, they climbed it themselves, hammer in hand, boots scraping against frozen metal. One woman in New Mexico replaced a gearbox single-handedly, using a crowbar and a prayer. "If it breaks again," she said, "so will I." It didn't. They learned to drive trucks, shoot rifles, trade livestock, and keep ledgers. They wrote to the War Food Administration, negotiating quotas and prices like seasoned businessmen. They were no longer just keeping the ranch alive, they were sustaining an entire economy of survival. Many of them had never touched a steering wheel before 1941. But by 1943, they were delivering cattle to rail depots 200 miles away. The station masters would tip their hats and say, "Didn't think a lady could handle that rig." They just smile, sign the bill of sale, and head home before dark. Evenings brought silence. The radio murmured war reports while they patched clothes under lamplight. Some kept a picture of their sons or husbands pinned above the sink, the edges curled from steam. They'd talk to it sometimes, not prayers exactly, but reports. The calf took well, one might say. The east fence held through the storm. Words sent into the air, hoping the wind carried them far enough. The children too learned to step up. A 10-year-old girl might milk before school, rake hay afterward, and fall asleep with her homework unfinished. They didn't complain. They watched their mothers and followed suit. Those daughters would grow into women who never asked what they were capable of. They already knew. During branding season, the smell of singed hair and smoke filled the air. The women handled the ropes and irons, their arms steady as any cowboys. A rancher from Colorado once said that if not for his wife, the war would have taken both his sons and his cattle. "She kept it together," he said. "I just came home to help her finish." They buried their fear under work. When word of a son lost overseas came, they didn't stop. They cried in the barn, wiped their faces with their sleeves, and went back to the herd. The animals couldn't wait for morning. Duty demanded motion, and motion dulled the ache. The land had no sympathy, but it offered something better: purpose. By 1944, the government finally recognized their effort, issuing posters that read, "Women feed the fight." But they didn't hang them in kitchens or barns. They didn't need slogans. They had proof in every bale of hay, every calf born, every letter that came home with the words "safe" scrawled inside. Their heroism wasn't photographed. It was lived in silence and sweat. When the war ended, many of the men returned to find that their wives had done more than hold the line. They had expanded it. The books were balanced, the stock grown, the ranches debt-free for the first time in decades. But the women didn't brag. They set another plate at the table, poured another cup of coffee, and let the men believe the world had waited for them. Deep down, they knew better. In the long story of the American ranch, these women were the unrecorded chapters, the quiet strength that carried generations. The war had proven something no speech could, that the frontier spirit had never been about gender, only grit. When the last letters arrived and the last sons came home, the land itself seemed to breathe easier. But peace brought its own demands, and soon the same hands that had fed a nation would be asked to feed the world. By 1943, America was running on hunger and hope. The factories along the Great Lakes thundered day and night, turning ore into steel, steel into tanks, tanks into power. But behind all that iron and smoke lay a quieter machine. Millions of acres of pasture, miles of fencing, and a people whose lives were measured not by shifts but by seasons. While cities forged the arsenal of democracy, the ranchers were feeding it. The government called it a food front. The War Food Administration sent out pamphlets explaining how every pound of beef, butter, and milk meant bullets, fuel, victory. "Meat is ammunition," one poster read, and the ranchers believed it. Their cattle became soldiers of a different kind, drafted, weighed, and shipped by rail to Chicago, Omaha, Fort Worth. Inside refrigerated cars, the breath of the plains turned into the lifeblood of armies half a world away. At the Swift and Armor plants, inspectors recorded shipments by the ton: beef to the European front, pork to the Pacific, tallow for soap and explosives, hides for boots and saddles. From the smell of curing rooms to the steam of rail yards, America's strength began in the dust of the open range. Out there, every ranch was a small arsenal. Its weapons were the shovel, the saddle, the branding iron. The quotas rose with every offensive overseas. The War Department demanded 25% more beef than the year before. Grain shipments were diverted to feed troops and horses, leaving ranchers to improvise with cactus pulp, hay, and cottonseed cake. They stretched every resource until there was nothing left to stretch, but no one complained. A man might curse the weather, but he didn't curse the cause. In Kansas, rancher Walter Pickens kept 2 notebooks, one for his herd, one for his sons. In the margins of feed tallies, he wrote short messages to them, lines like "cows held through the storm" and "the heifer calved early, strong one." He mailed those pages overseas when he could. When his eldest replied from Italy, the letter smelled faintly of diesel and rain. "I'll fight here," it read. "You keep fighting there." Ranchers became logisticians overnight. They tracked rail schedules, negotiated with packers, and learned to live with the tight grip of federal oversight. Inspectors walked their corrals, measuring weight, checking tags, noting yield. "Every pound counts," they said. The ranchers nodded and went back to work, pretending not to notice the irony that Washington now depended on the same people it once ignored during the Depression. Technology shifted too. Gasoline engines replaced mules, and portable windmills dotted the horizon to pump water for livestock. The women who had held the reins in wartime learned to run those machines with practiced hands. The roar of an engine at dawn became the anthem of American resilience. The ranch was not a relic, it was an industrial organ of the nation's body, beating quietly under its ribs. Even the waste had purpose. Animal fat was collected, melted down, and shipped to munitions plants where glycerin became the base for nitroglycerin. The irony wasn't lost on them. The same cattle that fed soldiers also fueled the bombs that ended battles. "We send them food and fire," one foreman said, shaking his head, "and both keep them alive." The scale of the effort was staggering. By 1944, U.S. ranchers supplied more than 60% of all meat consumed by Allied forces. Each week, nearly 150,000 rail cars left the Midwest carrying beef, pork, butter, and cheese. Yet behind the numbers lay the human cost, sleepless nights, overworked bodies, and the relentless rhythm of necessity. They weren't chasing profit, they were chasing enough. When the war finally began to turn in the Allies' favor, the ranchers felt it in the orders. Demand for canned meat surged before every major offensive. Normandy, the Bulge, Iwo Jima, all signaled not only battles fought abroad but drives begun at home. Every crate of meat was stamped with "Product of the United States," and in that stamp was pride, the kind that didn't shout, only nodded. In the heart of Texas, a small ranch near San Angelo became famous for meeting its quota 12 months straight without losing a single head of cattle. When a reporter asked the owner, an old man named Joe Ramirez, how he'd done it, he just smiled. "You keep the cows fed, the fences mended, and the Lord willing, the rest takes care of itself." That line ran in a paper few read, but it spoke for thousands. By VE Day, America had fed not only its army, but half the liberated world. Canned beef from Kansas reached the mouths of starving families in France and Belgium. Milk powder from Nebraska helped rebuild Europe's children before their fathers returned home. The ranchers never saw their names on the relief crates, but their fingerprints were there in the grain, in the grease, in the gift of survival. The arsenal of democracy had been more than guns and steel. It had been wheat, corn, cattle, and people too proud to give up. But victory came with a new trial. The skies that had finally cleared after war began to darken again. Not with bombs, but with drought. The land that had given so much was about to ask for everything once more. The first sign wasn't the dust, it was the silence. In the spring of 1944, the wind stopped blowing. The grass went still, the creeks slowed to mirrors, and the sky turned a shade of white that meant only one thing: no rain was coming. For a land that had just survived a decade of war and depression, the drought felt like a betrayal. The ranchers had given everything: sons, sweat, faith, and now the land itself seemed to turn against them. By midsummer, the ponds had cracked and the cattle bawled through dry throats. In Texas, Oklahoma, and Kansas, ranchers drove their herds for miles searching for grass that no longer existed. The soil, once black and fragrant after rain, broke into scales beneath their boots. Each step raised dust that stung the eyes and coated the lungs. "Feels like the 30s again," one man muttered, and everyone understood what he meant. It came at the worst possible time. The war still raged in Europe, and the nation's demand for beef was higher than ever. Washington didn't care about the weather. The orders kept coming. "Maintain output," the letters said, as if human endurance could be rationed. Ranchers burned through what little feed reserves they had, grinding corn cobs and cotton hulls into meal just to keep the herd alive. They watched calves die on their feet, ribs showing like shadows under hide. It wasn't neglect, it was nature's quiet cruelty. A ranch near Lubbock lost half its cattle in one season. The owner, a man named Emmett Ward, wrote in his ledger, "They go down easy now, like they're tired of standing." He buried them where they fell, too many to count. His wife stopped cooking meat for supper. The smell was too much to bear, but Emmett never left. "If I go," he said, "the wind wins." So he stayed, feeding the few survivors from his own stores, riding out every morning to count what was left. Across the plains, wells dried up. The government offered loans, but money couldn't buy water. Some ranchers drilled deeper, chasing a groundwater line that seemed to retreat with every foot. Others loaded their herds into trucks and drove north, following rumors of rain that seldom proved true. Along the highways, the convoys of cattle left trails of dust like funeral smoke. Yet even in ruin, there was stubborn grace. Neighbors shared what they had: bales, seed, diesel. One rancher from Nebraska mailed his cousin in Texas a single sack of oats, writing, "Don't eat it, plant it." The next year, that patch of oats grew into feed enough for 20 head, and hope enough for one more season. These were people who had learned that survival wasn't a miracle. It was a chain of small mercies. When fall came, the newspapers in New York and Chicago ran stories about the drought, calling it a minor setback in the war economy. But to those living it, there was nothing minor about watching generations of work wither under the sun. They saw the cattle as kin, living ledgers of a family's history, and losing them felt like losing themselves. Still, they kept to their routines. At sunrise, they walked the fence lines. At noon, they checked the sky, scanning for clouds that never thickened. At night, they sat on porch steps and listened to the crickets fade. Maybe next week, someone would say. And then they'd fall asleep to the sound of nothing. In January of 1945, the rains finally came. Thin, hesitant, like a visitor unsure of its welcome. The first drops hissed on hot ground and vanished. But then the clouds held. Water filled the cracks, soaked the dust, and brought a smell that made grown men cry, the smell of wet earth. They watched the land drink, slow and deep, like an old animal healing. The cattle staggered through the mud to drink, and the sound of their hooves in water was a kind of music. By spring, the grass had returned, not lush, but enough. Enough to begin again. The ranchers didn't celebrate. They'd learned not to trust fortune, only work. But as they watched the horizon darken with honest rain, they knew something simple and eternal. The land would always test them, and they would always answer. The war ended that same summer, but peace brought new trials, markets, memory, and the quiet erasure of those who had kept the country alive when it was starving. The spotlight turned away, and the noise of victory drowned out the sound of hooves and wind. The ranchers went back to their fences, their cattle, their lives. They didn't ask for thanks, but history was already forgetting them. The trains that once carried soldiers home now hauled prosperity. It came in the form of shiny tractors, new highways and factories roaring back to life. Across America, victory had a sound, the hum of progress, and for the first time in 15 years, people dared to believe in tomorrow again. The ration cards disappeared, store shelves filled, and the newspapers spoke of abundance. But out on the ranches, where the land still bore the scars of drought and war, abundance felt like something happening to someone else. The ranchers watched as cities grew fat and bright, while their own towns grew quiet. Men who had gone to war came home changed. They loved their country, but they'd seen another world. Cities alive with motion, paychecks that came every week, lights that stayed on through the night. Many never came back to the ranch. The open land that once called them home now felt like an echo from another lifetime. The government that had once begged for beef and grain now turned its attention to industry. Price controls faded, but so did the promises. The War Food Administration closed its offices. The contracts that had guaranteed a market for every calf vanished. Suddenly, the ranchers were back to the old game: too much supply, too little demand, and a long road between the two. Cattle prices dropped by half in 1946. The same men who had fed an army now found themselves borrowing against their own land to buy feed. It was a strange kind of irony. The nation that had depended on their endurance during its darkest years now celebrated a peace built on forgetting them. Magazines printed glossy photographs of suburban lawns, washing machines, and new cars, symbols of a future where no one had to break their back to live. The word modern meant leaving the old life behind. And for a generation of young men and women raised on the smell of sweat and soil, that sounded like freedom. But the old ones stayed. They mended their fences, counted their herds, and nodded when the neighbors left for town. "You can't leave land that remembers you," one said, watching a for sale sign go up on the next section over. "It'll call you back one way or another." He was right. The land has a memory, and it doesn't let go easily. For those who remained, there was work still worth doing. The herds grew again, leaner but stronger. The pastures that had turned to dust during the drought began to green under careful rotation and new methods learned the hard way. The lessons of the Dust Bowl had not been wasted. They planted shelter belts, dug deeper wells, and treated the soil like a living thing instead of a resource. Slowly, quietly, the land healed, and so did they. Yet even healing carried loneliness. The war had given their lives purpose, a clear reason to endure. Peace, in contrast, brought questions. What now? What was all the sacrifice for if the world they saved had no place for them? Some turned to faith, others to whiskey, others still to the quiet routine of sunrise chores and long rides through empty pastures. There was comfort in repetition, even if the rest of the nation had moved on. The newspapers wrote about America's golden age: new appliances, record harvests, cars with fins and radios in the dashboard. Out here, the only gold was in the grass at sunset, and the only harvest that mattered was the one that could feed a man's family. Still, there was a sense of pride beneath the weariness. The ranchers knew they'd done something few understood. They'd kept the nation standing when it could have fallen. They'd fought hunger with calloused hands and won, though no one wrote their names down for it. In time, their children grew up and left for the cities, trading dust for concrete. The ranch houses stood quieter, the mailboxes rusted, and the corrals filled with the ghosts of better days. But for those who stayed, there was no bitterness. They'd built something honest, something that couldn't be measured in money or headlines. When the rain came steady again, they rode the fence lines as they always had. The land looked the same, but the world beyond it had changed forever. The war was over, the depression was gone, and yet somehow the country felt hungrier than ever, for comfort, for ease, for more. Progress rolled forward, and with it came machines, debt, and a new kind of pressure that no drought could match. The open range was shrinking, and the quiet dignity of the small rancher was about to be tested again. This time not by nature, but by man's own appetite for more. The hum of engines replaced the creak of saddle leather. By the early 1950s, the American frontier had changed its sound. The war had taught the country to love machines. Tractors that could plow 50 acres in a morning, trucks that could haul cattle twice as far in half the time, and barbed wire that came coated rust-proof perfect. Progress, they called it. But for the old ranchers, progress came with a price tag they could barely afford. Credit became the new tool of survival. Banks that once ignored them now offered loans for modernization. They promised prosperity in pamphlets printed on glossy paper. New tractors, electric pumps, refrigeration units, concrete water tanks. But behind every promise came a contract, and behind every contract came interest. The ranchers who signed found themselves bound not by drought or debt to nature, but by the invisible rope of monthly payments. It was a new kind of dependence, clean and quiet, written in ink instead of dust. Some adapted. The younger generation, the sons who had come home from war with mechanical training, embraced the new machines. They traded horses for engines, notebooks for ledgers, and called themselves producers instead of ranchers. They wore hats still, but they were different men in a different America. The land was now a business, not a calling. Yields, efficiency, output, those were the words that mattered. But others resisted. They stuck to their mules, their windmills, their slow ways that followed the rhythm of grass and rain. They watched the fields turn to grid lines and the pastures shrink under power lines. They saw their children look toward the cities and universities, drawn to the comfort they themselves had built for them. Maybe it's supposed to go this way, one said, staring at the lights of a highway cutting through his grandfather's range. Maybe the country's outgrown us. The 1960s brought television and interstate highways, shrinking distances and stretching dreams. Urban America began to forget where its food came from. The grocery store became a magic place, shelves always full, prices low, meat wrapped cleanly in cellophane. Few thought about the wind, the dirt, or the men and women still out there under it. The ranchers didn't expect thanks, but they did notice the silence. The pride they once carried, the identity of feeding the nation, began to feel like a ghost story. Mechanization changed the work itself. One man could now do the labor of 10. Fewer hands were needed, and with that, communities began to thin. Schoolhouses closed. Church bells rang to smaller congregations. Where a dozen families once lived along a county road, only 2 remained. The land didn't vanish, but the people who gave it voice slowly did. In Montana, a rancher named Bill Dutton watched the change with quiet resignation. His father had taught him to mend fences by hand. Now he repaired tractor engines and negotiated grain futures. "We used to trade time," he said. "You help me brand, I help you haul. Now it's all invoices." His words carried no anger, just the tired awe of a man witnessing the end of something sacred. Corporations entered the picture. Meatpacking plants merged. Distributors grew powerful. Small ranches became small businesses struggling to survive in a world that measured value only in volume. The cattle still grazed, but the spirit of independence that once defined the range was slowly fenced in by paperwork. A handshake used to seal a deal. Now it took lawyers. Still, the land remained their anchor. Machines might change the rhythm, but the horizon stayed the same. Wide, untamed, endless. The old-timers still rode out before sunrise, engines growling beneath them instead of horses' hooves, and they still stopped at the top of the ridge to watch the first light spread across the plains. For all the noise of progress, that moment stayed quiet. By the 1970s, a few ranchers had grown wealthy. Most had not. Those who survived did so by leaning into debt, diversifying into grain or trucking, or simply refusing to quit. "It's not about winning," one said. "It's about lasting." That phrase could have been carved into every fence post from Texas to the Dakotas. But beneath the surface, pressure was building. Costs rose, interest climbed, and the market began to favor the big over the good. The family ranch, the bedrock of rural America, was about to meet its hardest reckoning yet. The same banks that once sold dreams of prosperity would soon come to collect on them. And when they did, the fields would fall silent again. Not from drought this time, but from despair. It began with numbers, not storms. Interest rates crept higher through the late 1970s, 10%, then 15, then 20. On paper, it was economics. On the ground, it was ruin. The banks called it a correction, the ranchers called it the end. They had borrowed through the good years, trusting the same institutions that once promised abundance. Now those same signatures bound them to an impossible arithmetic. You couldn't raise enough beef or wheat to keep up with debt that grew faster than the grass. The 1980s were supposed to be years of prosperity, but for rural America, they were years of foreclosure notices nailed to fence posts. Men who had survived drought, dust, and war stood in line at county courthouses, watching their family names auctioned to strangers. Pickup trucks loaded with furniture and photographs lined the highways, heading nowhere in particular. The land that had been home for generations was being sold acre by acre to pay back paper promises. In Iowa, Kansas, Nebraska, the same story played out with tragic rhythm. A rancher would walk into the kitchen, letter in hand, and say quietly, "They're taking it." His wife would nod, already knowing. There were no words left for loss of that size. Some packed up and left, some stayed on as tenants of land they once owned, and some, too many, never found a way to face it. The suicide rate among farmers doubled by 19. For those living it, it was simply heartbreak with a ledger. Machines, once sold as saviors, became anchors. Tractors, trucks, and pumps, all bought on credit, sat idle when fuel prices rose. The very tools of progress now chained their owners to banks. One man in Oklahoma stripped his combine for parts to sell, keeping only the steering wheel. "So I can remember how it felt to drive hope," he said. His voice carried no bitterness, just weariness. Yet amid the collapse, something older stirred, the stubborn endurance that had carried them through every other trial. Communities came together again, the way they had in the Dust Bowl days. Neighbors traded hay, shared equipment, watched each other's herds. Church suppers returned, not out of celebration but survival. When a ranch went under, the rest pitched in to move the cattle, clear the barns, and send the family off with dignity. They couldn't save each other from the banks, but they could save each other from shame. The government tried to help loan deferrals, relief programs, but for many it was too late. Corporate agriculture was rising, swallowing small operations like floodwater, swallowing low ground. The landscape began to change. Where a dozen fences once marked family lines, now one vast ranch, faceless and efficient, stretched from horizon to horizon. The smell of diesel replaced the scent of horses. The names disappeared. But not all were lost. In Montana, a young rancher named Sam Parker, third generation, refused to sell. He worked 3 jobs, ranching by day, hauling freight by night, fixing machinery on weekends. He slept 4 hours a night and paid off his father's debt penny by penny. "The land doesn't owe us comfort," he said. "It just gives us a place to stand." By the time the decade ended, he still had his fence lines, his herd, and his pride. He was one of the few. The cost of survival left scars deeper than any drought. Families fractured, traditions faded, but those who remained carried forward something indestructible. The quiet belief that a life's worth isn't measured by what you keep, but by what you refuse to surrender. As the 1980s bled into the early 1990s, the headlines moved on. The crisis was declared over, though in the small towns of the plains, its echo lingered. Empty houses, shuttered co-ops, abandoned rail sidings, each one a monument to promises that progress had broken. And yet in the stillness, the land waited. Grass returned where tractors no longer roamed. Prairie birds nested again where men had once planted rows of grain. Nature was reclaiming what commerce had left behind, as if reminding those who remained that the first and last truth of ranching was always the same: the land endures. Those who stayed learned to work with less, to listen again to the wind, to rebuild trust in the soil rather than the market. Out of hardship came humility, and out of humility came a strange peace. The survivors were fewer, older, quieter, but they carried a wisdom that couldn't be bought, only earned. And as America forgot them again, they continued their work as they always had, without applause, without complaint, anchored to something deeper than memory. But history was not finished with them. In the years that followed, a new understanding began to take root, one that would restore their dignity and redefine what it meant to be a steward of the land. By the time the century turned, the survivors of the old ranching world had grown gray. Their hands were slower, their voices quieter, but their eyes still scanned the horizon the same way their fathers had. The nation they once fed had changed beyond recognition, fast, digital, weightless, but the land beneath their boots remained stubbornly real. The grass still bent to the same wind, the cattle still followed the same paths to water, and the sun still rose with the same pale fire over the plains. Only now, it seemed, the country was finally beginning to remember them. It started with the soil. Scientists, conservationists, and journalists came west again, this time not to pity or romanticize, but to learn. After decades of industrial farming had drained rivers and exhausted the ground, attention turned back to the people who had somehow kept their pastures alive. They found that the small, stubborn ranches, the ones written off as relics, had been practicing what universities now called regenerative management all along. Rotation, rest, respect. Nothing fancy, just patience and observation passed from father to son, mother to daughter. The irony wasn't lost on the old-timers. They'd been mocked for their old-fashioned ways, for refusing to overgraze or overbuild, for believing that land and livestock could coexist like dance partners instead of enemies. Now suddenly, their names appeared in reports and documentaries as examples of sustainability. "We just did what worked," one said. Didn't know it was a movement. The younger generation, children of those who had left, began to trickle back. Some came out of nostalgia, others out of exhaustion from a life lived staring at screens and walls. They arrived to find barns leaning but still standing, pastures scarred but still fertile, and the quiet dignity of a rhythm the world had almost forgotten. They brought new tools, solar pumps, drones, satellite weather maps, but the work itself hadn't changed. Feed the herd, fix the fence, watch the sky, wait. In the evenings, when the work was done, they'd sit beside their grandparents and listen. The stories were simple but heavy, of droughts that broke men, of wars fought both overseas and in the fields, of years when the rain didn't come but the bills did. The old voices told them not to seek reward, only purpose. "You don't own this land," they'd say. "You borrow it from your children." That line carried the weight of a prayer. Slowly, the nation began to see them again, not as leftovers from a forgotten age, but as keepers of a truth that technology couldn't replace. Their humility became a model, their endurance a map. Environmental groups that once dismissed ranchers as exploiters now called them partners in restoration. Agencies sought their advice on managing grasslands, soil health, and water cycles. What they'd learned by instinct and pain became the foundation for a new science. But they never grew proud. When journalists came with cameras, the ranchers smiled politely, let them take their photos, and went back to work. They had no time for self-importance. The fences still needed mending, the calves still needed tending, and the horizon still had to be watched. The land was still the boss, and they were still its hands. In that return, quiet, slow, almost invisible, the circle began to close. The same people who had once fed the world through war and famine were now feeding its wisdom. Their endurance had outlasted industry. Their patience had outlived policy. They had become, without seeking it, the conscience of the countryside. Some nights, under the same wide sky that had watched them for generations, an old rancher would lean on his fence and listen to the wind rustle through the grass. He'd think of his father, of the war, of the dust, of the sons and daughters who had gone off chasing other lives. He'd smile faintly, not in sorrow but in peace, because the land was still here, and so was he. What the world called forgotten was, in truth, still holding it together. The ranchers hadn't vanished. They had simply faded into the background, like the roots of the prairie grass that keep the soil from blowing away. Invisible, but essential. And as the sun bled into the horizon one more time, they stood where their fathers once stood, hands resting on weathered fence posts, the smell of dust and sage in the air. They didn't talk about legacy. They didn't need to. The proof of it was all around them, breathing, growing, enduring. The circle of history was nearly complete, but before it could close, it had to be honored. Gratitude was the last debt left unpaid. The morning light comes slow again, just as it did 80 years before. A new hand rides the same fence line, boots sinking into the same red dust. The land hasn't changed much, it never really does. Wind still hums through the wire. Cattle still move like shadows across the grass, and somewhere in the distance an old windmill creaks its steady rhythm. But beneath that familiar sound lies a truth that few ever speak aloud. This country still eats because of people like them. The forgotten ranchers never stopped working, never stopped giving, and never once asked to be remembered. History moves fast in America. Wars, industries, elections, inventions, each one sweeping across the headlines like a flash flood. But the ranchers have always been the still water beneath it all. They are the reason the soldier marched with a full stomach, the worker went home to a hot meal, the family sat down to supper without wondering where it came from. While others built monuments, they built endurance. And though their stories seldom made the books, their labor is written into every acre that still feeds the nation. Now, in this quieter century, their legacy has returned like the rain after drought. People drive through the plains and call it empty. But those who know better can still feel what's buried there, the sweat, the sorrow, the quiet triumph of generations who asked nothing more than a fair sky and a good year. The fences they built still stand. The wells they dug still draw water. Their names may have faded from deeds and mailboxes, but the land remembers them the way an old tree remembers its roots. Grandsons and granddaughters walk the same pastures now. They bring new machines, new ideas, but the same old respect. They know their grandparents fought 2 wars, one against hunger, one against time, and that both were won without fanfare. They study the soil, speak of carbon and cycles, but underneath the science beats the same old truth. You take care of the land and it takes care of you. It's not progress, it's faith made practical. In town halls and documentaries, people now speak of sustainability, stewardship, resilience. The words are modern, but the spirit is ancient. It belongs to the men and women who worked when no one was watching, who endured when no one believed, who fed a nation and asked only that the land outlive them. They were never saints, never poets, just workers bound to the earth by an unspoken promise. Out on the plains at dusk, that promise is still visible. You can see it in the way the light bends over the grass, in the lines of a weathered barn, in the calloused hands that still pull a gate closed at night. It's there in the silence that follows, the deep, steady quiet of a country that owes more than it can ever repay. And perhaps that's the fitting end. Not applause, not monuments, but gratitude. A kind that lives not in words, but in continuity. Because every meal that fills an American table carries a piece of their labor. Every child who grows strong owes something to the men and women who, without medals or headlines, kept the nation alive through hunger, drought, war, and neglect. They didn't build it perfect. They built it honest, with rope and sweat and prayer, with hands that trembled but never stopped. They worked through the dust and the noise and the silence after. They gave more than they had and took less than they deserved. And when their time was done, they left behind no monuments, only fences that still hold, soil that still breathes, and a country that still eats. The circle closes not with glory, but with gratitude. Because though the world may forget their names, the land never will. The land remembers the hands that shaped it,